The radar screen flickered once, then went dark. In the operations center at Nellis Air Force Base, 6 analysts leaned forward, coffee forgotten, eyes fixed on the empty space where Ghost 72 had been transmitting just seconds before. Major Rachel Voss stood behind them, arms crossed, jaw tight. The C-130 Hercules had been carrying humanitarian supplies over the Sierra Nevada range when it vanished from every screen, every satellite feed, every tracking system the United States Air Force possessed. No mayday, no distress beacon, just silence, thick and absolute, like the aircraft had been erased from existence itself. Outside, the Nevada sun hammered down on the tarmac, heat shimmering in waves that made the F-22 Raptors look like mirages. Captain Torres stood beside his fighter, helmet under one arm, squinting toward the mountains. He'd heard the chatter. Everyone had. A cargo plane doesn't just disappear, not in clear weather, not with experienced crew. His wingman, Lieutenant Cade, approached with that same expression every pilot wore when something went wrong in the air, concern wrapped in forced calm. They'd been ordered to hold position, wait for search and rescue protocols. Standard procedure. But Torres had flown combat missions in 3 theaters, and he knew the difference between standard procedure and something else entirely. Inside the briefing room, the silence was suffocating. 12 pilots sat in rows, hands folded, watching the empty podium. Colonel Harkin entered without preamble, his face carved from stone. He didn't need to say much. A C-130 was down, location unknown, crew status unknown, weather conditions deteriorating. They needed volunteers for an expanded search pattern, pilots willing to push their fuel margins and fly low through mountain passes where thermals could flip a fighter like a coin. Every hand went up. Harkin's eyes moved across them, then stopped. He called 3 names, Torres, Cade, and one more that made several pilots exchange glances, Lieutenant Commander Evelyn "Widow" Thorne. She stood from the back row, moving with the economy of motion that came from 12 years in the cockpit. Some of the younger pilots had heard stories. Most dismissed them as exaggeration. Thorne was 41, older than most tactical pilots still flying active missions. She'd flown Navy F-A-18s off carriers before transitioning to Air Force exchange programs. They said she'd landed a burning Super Hornet on a carrier deck at night in a storm with one engine and failing hydraulics. They said a lot of things. What they knew for certain was that she rarely spoke, never smiled, and flew with a precision that made instructors uncomfortable. She'd earned her call sign the hard way, and nobody asked about it twice. The morning had started like any other. Now 3 fighters were about to launch into mountains where something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. Thorne pulled on her flight suit without expression, her movements automatic, her mind already in the sky. She'd buried a crew before. She had no intention of doing it again. The other pilots watched her walk toward the hangar, and in that moment, none of them could have guessed that by sunset, her name would be on every frequency from Nevada to Washington, spoken in tones that ranged from disbelief to something approaching awe. The 3 F-22 Raptors lifted off in sequence, afterburners painting the sky with thunder. Torres led the formation, Cade on his right wing, Thorne holding left position. Their flight path took them northeast, toward the last known coordinates of Ghost 72. The radio crackled with standard comm checks, call signs exchanged in clipped military brevity. Viper 1 copy, Viper 2 copy, Viper 3 copy. Thorne's voice was flat, emotionless, the kind of tone that came from speaking into a mask for so many years that inflection became unnecessary. They climbed to 20,000 feet, then dropped into the mountain corridor, the Sierras rising around them like jagged teeth against an increasingly gray sky. The weather forecast had mentioned possible afternoon storms. What they encountered was a wall of darkness that seemed to materialize from nothing, clouds boiling up from the valleys with violent speed. Torres banked left, trying to maintain visual with his wingmen. Cade's Raptor appeared and disappeared in the murk, a ghost of metal and thrust. Thorne held position with mechanical precision, her aircraft steady even as turbulence rattled Tor's teeth. They spread their search pattern wider, sensors sweeping the terrain below, looking for heat signatures, debris fields, emergency beacons, anything that would indicate where a four-engine transport aircraft had come to rest. Viper 1, this is Viper 3. I have terrain interference on my scope. Thorne's transmission cut through the static. Tor's checked his own displays. Nothing unusual. Viper 3, specify. There was a pause longer than tactical communication allowed. When Thorne spoke again, her voice had changed. Not louder, not faster, but harder. I'm picking up a distress frequency. Intermittent. Bearing 045, distance unknown. Requesting permission to break formation and investigate. Tor's hesitated. Breaking formation in these conditions violated half a dozen safety protocols. But that distress signal was why they were here. Viper 3, approved. Maintain radio contact every 60 seconds. Thorne's Raptor peeled away, angling deeper into the mountains, swallowed by clouds so thick they looked solid. Tor's and Cade continued their pattern, but both men found themselves checking their chronometers, counting seconds until Thorne's next transmission. 60 seconds passed, then 90. Tor's felt his grip tighten on the stick. Viper 3, Viper 1, radio check. Static answered him, punctuated by the hiss of interference that mountains and weather created. He tried again. Nothing. Cade's voice came across the squadron frequency, carefully neutral but edged with concern. Boss, we just lost her transponder. Tor's felt ice settle in his stomach. 2 aircraft missing now. The mission parameters were clear. If contact was lost, return to base. Regroup. Send in SAR with proper support. But Tor's had flown with enough pilots to know that some of them were worth breaking rules for. He'd never flown with Thorne before today, but he'd seen her service record. The parts that weren't classified anyway. Viper 2, stay on search pattern. I'm going after her. The storm had intensified, visibility dropping to near zero as Tor's pushed his Raptor through clouds that battered the aircraft like fists. His heads-up display showed terrain warnings, proximity alerts, a dozen reasons to turn back. He ignored them all, following the last bearing Thorne had transmitted, flying by instruments and instinct through a mountain range that had killed better pilots in better weather. Then, impossibly, the clouds broke. Just for a moment, just a narrow canyon of clear air between towering walls of granite. And there, perched on a narrow plateau like a broken bird, was the C-130. Its landing gear had collapsed, one wing crumpled, but the fuselage was largely intact. Smoke rose from one engine, black and oily. And circling above it, impossibly low, flying between rock faces with clearance measured in feet, was Thorne's F-22. She was orbiting the crash site, her fighter moving with a grace that seemed to defy physics, maintaining visual contact with the downed aircraft while simultaneously avoiding terrain that would have killed most pilots on first approach. Tor's had trained at Top Gun. He'd flown against the best pilots 3 nations could produce. He'd never seen anyone fly like this. Thorne's Raptor moved like it was part of her, extensions of thought rather than machinery. She rolled inverted to clear an outcropping, pulled through a turn that should have exceeded structural limits, then leveled out above the crash site with her gear down, flaps extended, moving at stall speed 1,000 feet above unforgiving granite. Viper 3, Viper 1. What are you doing? Tor's transmission sounded hollow in his own ears. Thorne's response came back immediate, cold, final. There are survivors. I count 3 personnel near the aircraft. They're alive. Tor's processed this, mind racing through the impossibility of what she was suggesting. Viper 3, confirm you are not planning to. Thorne cut him off. I'm landing. The plateau was maybe 800 feet long. A C-130 needed 3,000 feet of runway. An F-22 Raptor, designed for high-speed air superiority combat, had never been intended to land on anything shorter than a prepared airfield. The emergency specifications allowed for controlled crashes on roads, dry lake beds, nothing like this. Tor should have ordered her to pull up, return to base, wait for proper rescue assets. Instead, he heard himself say, "Copy, Viper 3. I'll maintain overwatch." He climbed, gaining altitude to get above the weather to maintain radio contact with base to watch what happened next. Below him, Thorne's Raptor began its approach. She came in perpendicular to the wind, compensating for crosswinds that would have made a normal landing challenging and making this one virtually suicidal. Her airspeed dropped to nothing, the fighter hanging in the air on thrust alone, nose-high bleeding momentum. Torres held his breath. Every pilot did the calculus automatically: speed, distance, wind, terrain. The numbers didn't work. Thorne touched down anyway. The Raptor's wheels hit granite with a screech audible even over the engine roar. Thorne immediately cut thrust, deployed every drag surface the aircraft possessed, stood on the brakes. The fighter decelerated violently, momentum carrying it forward toward the plateau's edge, toward the 1,000-foot drop that waited beyond. Torres watched, unable to breathe, as the distance closed. 50 feet, 25, 10. The Raptor stopped with its nose wheel hanging over empty air. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then Thorne's canopy opened. She climbed out, moving with the same mechanical precision she'd shown all day, disconnecting her oxygen, unstrapping her harness, dropping to the ground like she'd just parked at a grocery store. Torres found his voice. "Nellie's tower, this is Viper 1. You're not going to believe this." In the operations center, Major Voss listened to Torres' report with an expression that cycled through disbelief, shock, and something approaching religious awe. A Raptor pilot had just performed a landing that should have been impossible, on terrain that should have been unsurvivable, to rescue a crew that should have been already dead. The word spread through Nellie's like wildfire. In the crew rooms, maintenance bays, even the administrative offices, personnel stopped what they were doing to cluster around radios, listening to the live feed. Thorne's voice came through in fragments, calm and professional, reporting casualties, requesting immediate medical evacuation, describing terrain features for incoming rescue helicopters. She'd found 5 survivors from the C-130's crew of 7. 2 had serious injuries but were stable. The aircraft had suffered catastrophic electrical failure due to a lightning strike, causing total system shutdown. The pilot, Captain Ramirez, had managed a controlled crash through skill and pure luck. Now they needed help, and they needed it fast because the storm was closing in again and the plateau would be inaccessible within the hour. 3 HH-60 Pave Hawks launched from Nellie's, carrying pararescue jumpers and medical personnel. Torres maintained his orbit, marking the location, guiding them in. Below, Thorne had moved to the C-130, helping crew members prepare for extraction, administering first aid, doing everything except acknowledging the impossible thing she'd just done. When the helicopters arrived, threading through breaks in the weather with their own brand of courage, the PJs rappelled down and took over medical duties. The senior pararescueman, a master sergeant with 20 years of combat rescues behind him, approached Thorne as she stepped back from the patients. He looked at her, then at the F-22 perched on the plateau's edge, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've pulled pilots out of worse situations than this. Never seen one fly into one on purpose." Thorne's expression didn't change. "They needed help." The master sergeant nodded slowly. "That Raptor getting off this rock." Thorne turned to look at her aircraft, assessing damage, calculating possibilities. The landing had stressed the gear, possibly cracked struts, definitely exceeded a dozen maintenance tolerances. Taking off from this plateau, with its limited length and treacherous winds, would be only marginally less dangerous than landing had been. "Yes," she said simply. The master sergeant smiled, the kind of smile that came from watching someone do something extraordinary and knowing you just witnessed history. "Good luck, widow." Evacuation took 40 minutes. The injured were loaded first, strapped into rescue litters and winched up through rotor wash and gathering darkness. Ramirez, the C-130's pilot, was last. Before climbing into the rescue sling, he grabbed Thorne's arm. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but his good eye was clear. "You shouldn't have landed," he said. "No other aircraft was going to reach us in time." Thorne pulled her arm free gently. "I had the fuel. I had the skill. You had the need." Ramirez's grip tightened. "My crew has kids, families. Because of you, they're going home." Thorne said nothing. After a moment, Ramirez released her and rose into the sky, spinning slowly beneath the Pave Hawk, a broken man being carried to safety by people who specialized in impossible rescues. When the helicopters departed, Thorne stood alone on the plateau, wind whipping her flight suit, surrounded by mountains and approaching night. Tor's voice crackled over her radio. "Viper 3, this is Viper 1. How do you want to play this?" Thorne walked a slow circle around her Raptor, inspecting the landing gear with flashlight and experienced eyes. The struts had held, but barely. Hydraulic fluid leaked from one assembly, and the tire pressure on the left main gear was low. The aircraft was airworthy by the loosest definition of the term. Taking off would be dangerous. Staying would be worse. The temperature was already dropping, and the storm moving in would make this plateau inaccessible for days. She checked fuel, enough for one attempt, maybe two if she was willing to risk flaming out over the mountains. She climbed back into the cockpit, running through pre-flight checks that felt surreal given where she was sitting. Everything responded. The engines, battered but functional, spooled up when she advanced the throttles. Tors watched from above, saying nothing, as Thorne positioned the Raptor at the far end of the plateau. She had maybe 600 feet of usable space. Standard takeoff distance for an F-22 was 2,000 feet under ideal conditions. These conditions were anything but ideal. Wind gusted from 3 directions at once. Visibility was degrading by the minute, and she was taking off toward a wall of granite that rose another 1,000 feet above her position. Thorne sat in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, breathing the recycled oxygen that tasted like metal and rubber, and thought about the crew she'd just saved. She thought about Ramirez's words, about families and children, about the arbitrary mathematics of life and death that had put her in this position. She thought about her husband, Michael, dead 6 years now in a training accident that should never have happened. She thought about the call sign that had followed her ever since, widow. Some people thought it was cruel. She'd chosen it herself. A reminder that every flight could be the last one, that skill and caution and preparation only got you so far, that sometimes the sky took payment in blood and there was nothing you could do except accept it and keep flying. She'd made her peace with that. If this takeoff killed her, she'd die having saved 5 lives. The calculus seemed fair. She released the brakes. The Raptor accelerated slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as the engines reached full military power. The granite wall ahead grew larger, filling her vision impossibly close. Her airspeed climbed, 100 knots, 120, 140. She needed 160 minimum to rotate, to pull the nose up and commit to the sky. The plateau's edge rushed toward her, 150, 155. She pulled back on the stick. Raptor lifted, clearing the plateau's edge with feet to spare, angling upward into darkening sky. The granite wall loomed directly ahead, unavoidable, too close. Thorne banked hard left, threading between rock faces, her wingtip passing within yards of stone that would have torn the aircraft apart. She climbed, fighting for altitude, fighting through turbulence that tried to slam her back into the mountains. The damaged landing gear protested, hydraulics screaming, but held. Slowly, impossibly, she gained height. The mountains fell away beneath her. The storm tried one last time to kill her, throwing her fighter sideways with a gust that would have been fatal 10 seconds earlier. Then she was clear above the weather, the Raptor climbing into clean air and stars. Tor's voice on the radio sounded shaken. "Viper 3, Viper 1, nice flying." Thorne keyed her mic. "Viper 1, Viper 3, returning to base." Behind her, the Sierra Nevada range faded into darkness, keeping its secrets, having failed to claim either the C-130 crew or the pilot who'd refused to leave them behind. The flight back to Nellie's took 20 minutes. Thorne flew in loose formation with Tors and Cade, saying nothing, her mind already shifting to post-flight procedures, maintenance reports, the inevitable debriefing. She landed with damaged gear, touching down on foam the emergency crews had sprayed across the runway, the Raptor settling heavily but intact. When she taxied to her spot and shut down the engines, she could see the crowd. Every pilot on base, it seemed, had turned out. Maintenance crews, administrators, even the base commander. They stood in silence as she climbed down from the cockpit, her movements still automatic, still precise. Colonel Harkin approached first. He was a full-bird colonel with 30 years of service, a man who'd seen combat in 3 wars and trained 2 generations of fighter pilots. He stopped in front of Thorne, looked her in the eyes, and extended his hand. "Lieutenant Commander," he said formally. "That was the finest piece of flying I've witnessed in my career." Thorne shook his hand. "5 people needed help, sir. I provided it." Harkin smiled, a rare expression that transformed his face. "Yes, you did." Around them, the crowd erupted into applause. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Thorne sat at a table in a windowless room and answered questions about weather conditions, terrain assessment, aircraft performance, decision-making process. She spoke in the same flat tone she always used, describing impossible maneuvers and split-second judgments like she was reciting a grocery list. The officers conducting the debriefing, 2 majors and a lieutenant colonel from flight safety, listened with expressions that ranged from professional interest to barely concealed amazement. When they asked her to describe the landing approach, Thorne pulled out a notepad and drew diagrams, marking wind vectors and glide slopes and obstacle clearances with mathematical precision. "The crosswind component was 23 knots gusting to 30, she explained. "I compensated by approaching from bearing 270 instead of the preferred 240, accepting higher risk from terrain in exchange for better wind alignment. Touchdown occurred at 147 knots, with full flaps and maximum braking immediately applied. Total ground roll was 732 feet by my best estimate." The lieutenant colonel leaned back in his chair. "You estimated all of that in the moment?" Thorne met his eyes. "Yes, sir." "While flying through a storm?" "Yes, sir." The lieutenant colonel exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Lieutenant Commander, do you understand that what you did today violated approximately 47 separate regulations?" Thorne nodded. "Yes, sir." "And you did it anyway. 5 lives were at stake, sir." The lieutenant colonel smiled. "Goddamn right they were." The story spread beyond Nellie's within hours. Fighter pilots were gossips worse than any civilian profession, and a tale this extraordinary couldn't be contained. It jumped from Nevada to California, to the Pentagon, to Navy bases and Air Force installations across the country. By morning, every tactical pilot in the United States military had heard some version of the story. A pilot had landed an F-22 on a mountain plateau to rescue a downed crew, then taken off again from impossible terrain in deteriorating weather and lived to tell about it. The details varied in the telling. Some versions had her landing on a space the size of a tennis court. Others claimed she'd done it with one engine out. But the core remained constant. Widow Thorne had done something no one thought possible, and she'd made it look routine. In the fighter community, legends were born from moments like this. Pilots who'd never met Thorne found themselves defending her in bars, recounting her career highlights, explaining the significance of what she'd accomplished. The mockery that had followed her for years, about her age, her gender, her reserved nature, evaporated like morning dew. Nobody laughed at Widow anymore. 3 days after the rescue, a ceremony was held in Nellie's main hangar. The hangar could hold 1,000 people, twice that many showed up. Thorne stood at attention while the base commander read the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The words washed over her: extraordinary achievement, risk of life, heroism and skill. She focused on a point on the far wall and waited for it to end. When the commander pinned the medal to her uniform, the assembled crowd erupted in applause that echoed off metal walls and concrete floors. Ramirez was there, still bandaged but on his feet, along with his crew. They stood together, watching the pilot who'd saved their lives receive recognition that everyone agreed was inadequate for what she'd done. After the ceremony, people wanted to talk to her, to shake her hand, to hear the story firsthand. Thorne endured it for an hour, then slipped away to the one place on base where she knew she'd find peace, the maintenance hangar where her Raptor was undergoing repairs. She found her crew chief, a master sergeant named Patterson, doing final checks on the landing gear assembly. He looked up when she approached. "How's she looking?" Thorne asked. Patterson wiped his hands on a rag. "We replaced both main gear struts, 3 hydraulic lines, and about 40 fasteners that showed stress damage. She'll fly again, ma'am, but she's been through hell." Thorne ran her hand along the Raptor's fuselage, feeling the cold metal, the rivets and panels and access ports. She held together when it mattered. Patterson nodded. That she did. You both did. They stood in comfortable silence, two professionals who understood machines and risks and the thin margin between success and disaster. That evening, Thorne sat in her quarters, door closed, reviewing the mission footage. Every modern fighter recorded everything: flight data, cockpit communications, heads-up display video. She watched herself make the approach, saw the plateau rushing up, saw the margins narrow to nothing. She watched the takeoff, the near collision with the granite wall, the desperate climb through storm clouds. She watched it clinically, professionally, looking for errors she could learn from, for decisions she'd make differently next time. When she finished, she closed the laptop and sat in darkness, thinking about nothing in particular. A knock on her door interrupted the silence. Torres stood outside, still in flight suit, looking uncomfortable. "Commander Thorne, sorry to bother you." Thorne gestured him inside. Torres entered, closing the door behind him. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then spoke. "I wanted to say thank you for what you did up there. Most pilots would have called for rescue assets and maintained altitude. You didn't." Thorne studied him. "You would have done the same." Torres shook his head. "No, I wouldn't have. I don't have your skill, your experience, or your courage. Nobody does." He paused. "I've been flying fighters for 8 years. I thought I was good. Watching you up there, I realized I don't know shit." Thorne almost smiled. "You maintained Overwatch in terrible conditions. You guided rescue in when they needed it. You did your job." "You did everyone's job," Torres said, "including mine." He extended his hand. "It was an honor flying with you, ma'am." Thorne shook his hand. "The honor was mine, Captain." News coverage started on day 4. CNN ran a segment titled Guardian Angel, featuring interviews with the rescued C-130 crew and aviation experts who tried to explain the technical difficulty of what Thorne had accomplished. Fox aired footage of the ceremony, lingering on shots of the Distinguished Flying Cross. Online, the story went viral. Aviation enthusiasts dissected every aspect of the flight, creating simulations, analyzing the physics, debating whether the landing was luck or skill. The consensus emerged quickly: skill, absolutely, but also something else. Something that couldn't be taught or measured, that existed in the space between calculation and instinct. Fighter pilots had a word for it: airmanship. Thorne had it in abundance. The social media response split along predictable lines. Some celebrated her as a hero. Others questioned whether regulations should have been followed, whether the risk was justified, whether a male pilot would have been praised or criticized for the same actions. Thorne ignored it all. She'd never had social media accounts, never read online comments, never cared what strangers thought. The opinions that mattered came from fellow pilots, from the crew she'd saved, from people who understood what happened in that moment when she chose to land. Everyone else was background noise. On the 5th day, Thorne received orders to report to the Pentagon. She flew commercial, sitting in coach, reading a paperback mystery novel, and ignoring the stares from passengers who recognized her from television. At the Pentagon, she was ushered into an office 3 levels underground, where a 2-star general and a civilian deputy secretary waited. They offered her coffee, which she accepted, and a promotion to commander with a position at Tactical Air Warfare Center, which she declined. The general, a stern woman named Blackwood who'd flown combat missions in Desert Storm, raised an eyebrow. "You're turning down a promotion." Thorne set down her coffee. "With respect, ma'am, I'm a pilot, not an instructor or an administrator. I belong in the cockpit." Blackwood studied her for a long moment. "What you did at Sierra Nevada was extraordinary, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Regulations exist for reasons, Commander. They keep pilots alive." Thorne nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They also sometimes prevent pilots from doing what needs to be done. I understood the risks. I accepted them. 5 people are alive because of that decision." The civilian deputy secretary leaned forward. "And if you died, if the aircraft had crashed on takeoff," Thorne met his eyes, "then I'd have died attempting a rescue. There are worse ways to go." Blackwood smiled grimly. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago, too brave for your own good." She signed a document and slid it across the desk. You're getting the promotion anyway, and you're staying at Nellie's as senior tactical instructor. You'll train the next generation of fighter pilots to be half as good as you are. That's an order, Commander. The months that followed brought changes Thorne hadn't anticipated. Student pilots arrived at Nellie's with her name already memorized, her career highlights studied like scripture. In the briefing rooms and simulators, she became the standard everyone measured themselves against. She taught them air combat maneuvering, taught them weapons employment, taught them the thousand small skills that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. But mostly, she taught them judgment, how to assess risks, how to make decisions under pressure, how to balance regulations against necessity. Some students came expecting war stories. Thorne disappointed them, focusing instead on fundamentals, on building muscle memory and situational awareness. But occasionally, usually late in the evening when the day's training was complete, a student would ask about Sierra Nevada. Thorne would pause, choosing her words carefully, and tell them the truth. I did what was necessary with the tools I had available. You would have done the same. The students always disagreed. Thorne never pushed back. Let them believe what they wanted. She knew the truth, that circumstances and training and luck had aligned in exactly the right way, and that a different day, a different pilot, a different set of variables might have produced catastrophe instead of success. She'd been fortunate, nothing more. In the fighter-pilot community, though, a quiet transformation occurred. The old jokes about age and gender faded. The whispered doubts disappeared. When pilots gathered in bars or ready rooms, when they debated tactics or swapped stories, Thorne's name came up in tones previously reserved for legends. Chuck Yeager, John Boyd, Robin Olds. The pantheon of fighter aviation had a new member, and she was still flying. Younger pilots sought her out, asking questions, requesting mentorship, hoping some of her skill would rub off through proximity. Thorne accommodated them when she could, but she remained fundamentally unchanged, quiet, professional, emotionally distant. The acclaim bothered her more than the mockery ever had. She'd done her job, nothing more. But the military loved its heroes, and Thorne had become one whether she wanted the title or not. Her call sign took on new meaning. Widow had been about loss, about the price she'd paid for a life in the cockpit. Now it meant something else. Survivor guardian, the pilot who came back from impossible situations and brought everyone home. The evolution felt appropriate. Michael would have approved. 1 year after the rescue, on a clear Nevada morning with visibility unlimited, Thorne led a four-ship formation of F-22s through advanced tactical maneuvers. Her students flew with precision, holding formation through high-G turns and defensive splits, demonstrating skills they'd sweated to acquire. She pushed them hard, harder than most instructors dared, because she knew what combat demanded, and she refused to send pilots into battle unprepared. When they landed, she critiqued each pilot's performance with detailed precision, noting mistakes, highlighting successes, always pushing them toward improvement. They absorbed every word, knowing they were learning from someone who'd proven herself in ways that transcended simulation and textbook scenarios. After the debrief, Thorne walked to her Raptor for post-flight inspection. The aircraft had been fully restored after the Sierra Nevada incident, every damaged component replaced, every system tested and certified. But Thorne still checked it personally after every flight, running her hands over control surfaces, examining hydraulic connections, looking for the small flaws that could cascade into catastrophic failures. Patterson joined her, carrying a clipboard. "She's solid, ma'am. No discrepancies." Thorne nodded. "Good. Schedule her for the next training cycle." That evening, Thorne drove to a small cemetery on the edge of Las Vegas. She parked under a tree, walked between rows of headstones, and stopped at one marked with Michael Thorne's name and the dates of his too short life. She came here every few months, always alone, always in silence. She didn't believe in ghosts or afterlives, but standing here made her feel connected to something larger than herself, to the continuum of pilots who'd flown before her and the ones who'd follow after. She thought about the 5 people she'd saved, about their families and futures, about the butterfly effect of one impossible landing. She thought about her students, young and eager and terrified and brave. She thought about the call sign she carried, about loss and survival and the price of both. After 10 minutes, she turned and walked back to her car. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow she'd fly again. Tomorrow she'd teach again. Tomorrow she'd continue doing the only thing she'd ever been good at, being a pilot. The sky waited, infinite and indifferent, ready to welcome her or kill her with equal dispassion. Thorne had made her peace with that uncertainty years ago. She climbed into her car and drove toward the neon glow of Las Vegas, toward her quiet apartment and quiet life, carrying her legends and losses like extra weight in her flight bag. Behind her, the cemetery faded into darkness, keeping its own silent watch over the ones who didn't make it home. She had. That was enough.